Recently, we've watched paralyzed patients play video games, study calculus, and control robotic arms to feed themselves using only their thoughts. Because of Elon Musk's massive platform, a lot of people think Neuralink invented the brain-computer interface and that they are the only option available. But the truth is, this is an incredibly crowded medical field, and several other companies have had devices implanted in humans for much longer. Every single one of these companies is trying to solve the exact same engineering dilemma, balancing surgical safety against neural resolution. You can either have a highly invasive surgery that captures incredibly precise brain signals, or a much safer procedure that barely captures enough data to click a mouse. Today, we are going to strip away the viral marketing. We'll look at Neuralink's hardware, the strict clinical realities, and the digital security against its top competitors, so you can see what users are sacrificing for that performance. We evaluate devices using this quadrant chart. The vertical axis measures bandwidth, data pulled from the brain. The horizontal axis measures surgical invasiveness. Synchron sits bottom left, low risk, low bandwidth. Neuralink sits top right, high bandwidth but requires invasive open skull surgery. Choosing a BCI is never about finding a magical, objectively perfect piece of technology. It is a calculated decision about which massive physiological trade-off a patient is willing to endure. Let's look closely at this comparison matrix covering the top 3 BCI competitors, Synchron, BlackRock, and Neuralink. We are going to grade them on how they get into the body, how much data they capture, and the long-term physical risks they carry. We'll start with Synchron's stent road. Instead of drilling through the skull, doctors guide this device up through the jugular vein in the neck and park it in a blood vessel resting just over the brain's motor cortex. That avoids open brain surgery entirely, which is a massive win for safety. But because the electrodes are trapped inside a blood vessel, they can only pick up broad, muffled population signals across 16 channels. Users manage basic texting and clicking, but fine motor control is physically impossible. BlackRock Neurotech takes a much older, more direct approach with their Utah array. A surgeon physically removes a piece of the skull and presses a rigid silicone square covered in 96 tiny spikes directly into the surface of the brain. BlackRock has decades of clinical data proving their device works long-term. The problem is mobility and safety. The array relies on wires that literally protrude through a permanent metal pedestal in the patient's scalp, which creates a constant, lifelong risk of infection. Neuralink took these limitations and engineered a different physical approach. Their N1 chip is fully wireless, hidden under the skin, and relies on 1,024 independent channels distributed across microscopic flexible polymer threads. Because the brain constantly shifts by fractions of a millimeter with every heartbeat and breath, a human hand cannot implant these threads without shredding tissue. That is why Neuralink built the R1 surgical robot to sew those threads deep into the cortex. The payoff for that engineering is a market-leading 7 to 10 bits per second of data output. That density is what allows Neuralink patients to smoothly pilot drones or play fast-paced strategy games wirelessly. But the cost is steep. You are subjecting yourself to a robotic craniotomy and placing hundreds of foreign objects deep into your brain tissue, and the human immune system's natural response to a foreign object is to encapsulate it in scar tissue, which degrades the electrical signal over time. By choosing deep penetration with over 1,000 flexible threads, Neuralink is prioritizing high-fidelity resolution over the established long-term safety data of surface-level implants.
Hardware specs look great on paper, but getting one of these devices in your head today means enrolling in an intense clinical trial. Neuralink's current testing phase is called the PRIME study, and eligibility is incredibly tight. You must have quadriplegia, meaning limited function in all 4 limbs, due to a spinal cord injury or ALS. You must be at least 1 year post-injury without improvement and have a consistent, reliable caregiver. If you look at the study timeline on this chart, you'll see this is a 6-year commitment. It starts with an intense 18-month primary phase with frequent clinic visits, followed immediately by 5 years of long-term monitoring. And during that entire primary window, you are contractually obligated to participate in a minimum of 2 BCI research sessions every single week. This requires a caregiver to be heavily involved to manage the logistics and charging of the device. Patients also have to mentally weather sudden experimental failures.
A few months after his surgery, Neuralink's first human patient watched roughly 85% of his electrode threads unexpectedly retract from his brain tissue, crippling his device's performance until engineers recalibrated the software. Enrolling in the PRIME study requires the stamina of a multi-year second job for both the patient and their family. While the physical risks fall directly on the early trial patients, Neuralink's long-term business strategy to scale to millions introduces a different kind of danger. Researchers at Yale University recently analyzed the cybersecurity of the latest BCI devices. They found that while the physical hardware is tightly regulated by the FDA, the software operating these chips exists in a loosely regulated gray area. The issue boils down to battery constraints. Running heavy encryption protocols on data requires a lot of processing power. If you force the N1 chip to do that much processing, it drains the tiny internal battery and generates excess thermal heat against the brain. To solve the heat and battery problem, Neuralink chose to transmit user brain signals wirelessly to phones and computers without utilizing standard data encryption. In a trial of a few dozen people, that's a minor risk. But if the technology scales to millions of users, standardizing unencrypted wireless neural data exposes an entire population to the risk of mass data breaches or the direct manipulation of their cognitive functions. To prioritize wireless portability, Neuralink opted to transmit a direct map of the user's neural activity across the airwaves without any standard digital protection. Neuralink is an aggressive engineering bet. They are betting that their micron-level robotics and flexible materials can outsmart the human brain's natural immune defenses. If you or a family member are actually navigating this landscape, look at this decision tree. If a patient is highly risk-averse, refuses to undergo open brain surgery, and just needs basic communication tools to text or browse the web, they should look exclusively at Synchron's vascular approach. If a patient or researcher needs certainty that the hardware will function for decades and they don't mind the restriction of a physical wire, BlackRock's Utah array remains the medical standard. But if the primary goal is achieving fluid, high-speed digital autonomy, the ability to seamlessly use computers and play games wirelessly, Neuralink is the only device currently hitting those metrics. Right now, that choice is strictly reserved for patients with severe paralysis, a strong support network, and a willingness to navigate experimental unknowns. Elon Musk's larger vision, putting chips in healthy people to merge humans with artificial intelligence, faces a much harder reality. Neuralink's true hurdle isn't engineering a robot that can successfully insert 1,000 delicate threads today. It is proving that the human body will actually tolerate those threads a decade from now.